Monday morning you sure look fine. Friday I've got travelling on my mind. The secretary looked up as Tom's humming quietly broke into song. I beg your pardon, sir? Tom looked up at the secretary and gave her an apologetic smile. The Shilvanti woman looked to be in her mid-40s, and they had exchanged the occasional pleasant smile. As the wait outside the office of head administrator Vemi Rasani passed 30 minutes and was fast approaching 45, the pleasant smiles lapsed into embarrassed glances. Tom had learned the value of being able to smile at Shilvanti women, but not too much, and after settling into the oversized and uncomfortable metal chair, he closed his eyes and started to hum, passing the time. The chair was no help. After coming home to spend the week with Leia, he'd walked into the arms of her mothers, quite literally, as it happened. The matriarch of Shalea's family was Della Lanar, and her co-wives were Phyllis Galeen, Kolanar, and Higo Reges Kolanar. They were huggers. That wouldn't have been bad, as such, but they were also Shamanta worshippers making themselves at home for the week, naked as the day they were born. They'd done their best to put Tom at ease, which hadn't helped in the least. Sleeping on the couch instead of with his fiancée hadn't made matters any better. Even stiff as a board, he'd come to school today with a bit more spring in his step than he'd expected. At least he'd gotten out of camping. It was a week in a comfortable home with 3 naked seniors, as opposed to 2 days spent naked around a campfire with them, as the Shilvanti winter dropped the temperatures well into the 40s. It was a trade-off, but he could live with it. Well, maybe not the couch, but the principle was there, and he could stick to it. Mind you, the chair was not helping. Everything about Soche seemed built for function. And while it underscored just how much money the Academy had, the hard metal chair was a perfect example. It might have reflected the utilitarian look the school seemed to have all over, but after nearly an hour he'd begun to suspect it was there to torture wayward students and unwelcome guests. The long wait wasn't helping his back. He had a class to teach in just over an hour, and while wandering the labyrinth of hallways, being stared at by the students didn't have much appeal, at least he would get the kinks out. Still, he had an appointment. Vemi Rasani had asked to see him at 10 a.m., and it was now well past that. Passing the time by closing his eyes and quietly humming to himself was the best he could manage. Lapsing into quietly singing the verse was a bit much, even if the secretary couldn't understand English. It was a good song, though, and apt. It was the first day after Shell, which made it a Monday for all practical purposes. He was dressed up in his best Academy suit for his first day, which made him stand out. Unlike the black and white favoured by the Academy, Soche's colours were a muted purple and dark blue. During his first few weeks at Empress Zarika's Academy for Young Ladies, he'd felt like an extra in The Prisoner. While he had sometimes lapsed into what's black and white jokes in the back of his head, it had become normal. Walking into Soche felt like a riot of colour. The pins and armbands and scarves of house colours seemed to be rarer among the students, but at least the splashes of colour so common at the Academy were alright. Everything went with black and white. Purple and blue did not, and he'd seen a few girls and one boy walk past in some truly eye-searing combinations. Still, there were boys here. Even carefully guarded by their presumed girlfriends, he spotted a few on his walk in. He'd even counted 3 Rakiri. Alright, he had 6 Shilvanti girls in his class and no boys, but he had a Pezrin. Ganya was right. This would be a chance to really get out and see something different. Broaden his skills. See life outside the Academy. At least, if he survived this chair and his future in-laws. He tried in vain to stretch and find some measure of comfort. It was a Monday, and if it didn't look as fine as it had before, he still had 5 days here. His printed curriculum was fluff, didn't cover half a page, and he was facing teaching it by rote, but he could find something to cover the time. Tom looked down at his bag, pondering the thermos of coffee he'd packed away with his lunch. If this was going to go on much longer, he could... "Mr. Warwick?" The secretary's voice broke into his reverie. "The head administrator will see you now." Vemi Rasani wore the school colours of purple and blue on a checkerboard jacket, complete with matching purple slacks and a vibrantly blue blouse. It might have been meant to pleasantly contrast. Maybe to a Shivanti it did. Standing somewhere just short of 7 feet tall, she was a hawkishly thin woman with wiry silver hair, wound into curly locks that would have looked at home on Shirley Temple, and as she invited him into her office, her manner had been brusque. She might have given him a look over once or twice, but she glanced at his outfit, more than once, in barely hidden distaste. Even allowing for the mutual dislike she shared with Ganya Sasano, it seemed a bit much. Settling in behind her desk, she absently waved him in the direction of a chair. The furniture was as Spartan as Ganya's was comfortable. Hard metal dominated every surface, and the furniture screamed utility. The sole exception was a set of personal photographs in a rotating display behind her desk. Rasani and Ganya might have contended over Ganya's boyfriend somewhere in their past, but she'd clearly gone on to marry. Tom glanced over at the offered chair. It looked just as uncomfortable as the one outside. "Mr. Warwick, welcome to Soche Pantechnical." Her voice wasn't any more welcoming than her expression, and it was a feeling he hadn't had since being on Earth. "I am assured by Professor Borai that you've been briefed on the coursework, and it should be within your means. I wanted to take this opportunity and ask if you have any questions." "Within my means? Great. Not as such." Tom tried to plaster on an easy smile. She might have family on Earth, or maybe her feud with Ganya ran as deep as Miv had hinted. Either way, it seemed like he should just make the best of it. "I'm sure it will be a valuable experience teaching here at Soche, and I wanted to thank you for having me." "Yes, I expect it will be rather different for you. Soche doesn't cater to the nobility. We take a more practical approach to education and pride ourselves on diversity here." Rasani arched an eyebrow at him. She might have looked down her nose at him as well. At her height, it would be hard not to, and he might have been imagining it. "I'm told you're used to having a co-professor to hold your hand, but you'll be teaching alone this week," she added. "I hope you'll be able to manage." "Okay, fine. Not imagining it." "Thank you, Head Administrator. Professor Borai was kind enough to send me material that seems well suited to me as a male." Tom gave himself brownie points for keeping the smile, and saying it without sarcasm. It was very thoughtful of her. "Yes, I'm sure she'll be very good for your students." Rasani smiled. And there was the look. Even married and older, she let her eyes run over him now he painted himself into the "I'm just a defenseless male" category. "See, Tom, you're getting an education already." "I have a busy day ahead, but do come and see me if you need anything at all, Professor." As double entendres went, it was half-hearted and might have been thrown in for old time's sake. Tom still excused himself and made for the faculty lounge. If he could avoid getting lost, that still left him time to store his lunch and get to the classroom with time to spare. It was almost 11 in the morning. Class would be well underway back home. Islia Borai seemed nice enough, and Mavere had exchanged pleasantries with the woman for an hour before class. Borai had looked over the facilities with a mixture of pleasant surprise, mixed with occasional hints of avarice Mavere understood too well. Shalea taught with far less generous resources than Soche, but Borai's expression made her count her blessings all the same. She was a nice enough girl in her late 30s, with her hair worn short and a no-nonsense purple jacket, with a blue skirt and blouse. Having finished her section of the class, Miv settled into her chair to finish out the hour as Borai stepped up to the lectern.
Good morning, class. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Professor Borai, and I am from Sorche Technical.
Borai took a moment to look around the room at the faces seated above her before giving a nod.
I look forward to spending the week with your faculty, and I'm sure we'll have a wonderful time. Now, please turn to section 31 in your student materials and read the opening lines for me, Miss Belder.
Miv watched as Belder blinked uncertainly. There was no doubt in her mind why, but she wasn't supposed to interfere.
Today, Miss Belder? Ma'am, it's just that I prefer to be addressed as Professor or Professor Borai, young lady.
Borai sniffed and jutted her tusks at Belder in a peremptory manner.
And I expect you to stand. Yes, Professor.
Belder pulled up her omnipad.
It's just that we're covering section 30 and yes. The events of the human year of 1913. Humans managed a working production line and actually invented the highway. I'm sure it's all very fascinating from a certain point of view, but I wanted to give us something more exciting. Section 31. Begin, please. Yes, Professor.
Belder stood up and swiped through her omnipad.
For Hitler, 1914 began the First World War and the greatest of all experiences. Like a minority of veterans in all armies, he had found the excitement and even the dangers of the trenches enlarging, even uplifting. His bravery had won him medals and the good opinion of his officers, while his admission to a circle of comradeship, after years of life as a down and out in the back streets of Vienna, would create his burning belief in the superiority of the German nation above all others, and a consuming humiliation at the Peace of Versailles. Thank you, Miss Belder. You may sit down.
Borai was already looking back down at her seating chart.
Ma'am, Professor?
Borai looked back up and blinked owlishly.
Yes, Miss Belder? What is it?
Belder's eyes flickered to Professor Pelavon before she continued.
You don't want to ask questions on the material? Reading from the book is quite sufficient. There's no wisdom in questioning the authority of the author, even a human one.
Borai huffed, jutting her tusks at Belder dismissively.
Clearly, this Hitler woman had a sensible attitude. Not everyone is born into privilege, and you could learn a lesson there. Now, sit down. Please carry on with the next paragraph, Miss Deshin.
Tom looked at the small sea of faces just above him. The classroom at Sorche had the usual amphitheatre arrangement, though the tiers weren't as stacked. He didn't feel like he was at the bottom of a well. Though on the other hand, if there weren't only 7 students, he wouldn't have been able to see their faces so clearly. At capacity, the seating chart he'd been sent would be a must. Right. It's a pleasure to meet all of you. My name is Tom Warwick. I'm a human from the planet Earth, and it's my pleasure to be here with you for this week. It's an exciting opportunity for me, and I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you. Tom smiled as he took in their faces. He tried very hard not to stare at the Pezrin girl, who was staring at him with an almost unblinking fixation. So, we don't have much material to go over. Together, we're going to look at the Literary Gazette for Young Men, founded over a millennia ago by Loris Reveic to, set a proper model for young Shulvanti manhood. And I think I've just gone over 10% of my notes for the whole damn week. This is insane. So, let's take some time to get to know each other. Tell me about yourselves. Thunderous silence. Alright, thunderous silence and some questionably lecherous looks from at least 2 of the girls, as if they couldn't decide what to make of him. Great, I'm back to square one. I knew they learned from rote, but this is ridiculous. There was no doubt the girls were paying attention. The Pezrin still looked at him with an intensity he was starting to find unnerving. Still, there weren't a lot of options. There was no way he was going to make that outline stretch a day, much less a week. Anyone? Zin Shiki had nearly frozen in place when she walked in the classroom. It was a human. Not just a human, but the human. The hunter she'd seen over Shell was right there in front of her. The Dark Mother herself must have heard her prayers, and she had to force herself to walk casually to her desk, as if she'd never actually been surprised. She settled in as the human gave them looks, and bared his teeth now and then. It didn't mean anything coming from a Shorvanti, but from a proper hunter, even if they weren't Pezrin, who could say? He could be bearing them in challenge, as a pride trainer properly would. She moved carefully, betraying not the least failing in Murasaic. Even if it was wasted on the shill, she had her self-respect. Who knew how keenly the human hunter understood such things? Word of the prowess possessed by human warriors had begun to spread through the scattered warbands. Some even claimed to have fought alongside them. Regardless of the truth, he was an elder, certainly, and wouldn't be naive. She made sure to settle her fur in place, though every time he looked her way she could feel it wanting to rise along her neck. An actual prize, within leaping distance. Alright, it was known that he was wounded. There were the oaths about such things, and they were inviolate. The notion of cheating the hunt would forever bar a girl from the rights of womanhood and taking a mate. It was a fate not worth considering, and she certainly never stained her pelt with dishonor that way. Maybe it wasn't worth it, though. The human calling himself Warwick didn't seem to need the assistance of the stick, but he had it all the same. He defeated a Shorvanti admiral in single combat, but the Shorvanti had laws about killing. They were sensibly open-minded about the religious rights of all species, but they shared the ridiculous attitude about first hunt that other species seem to have. It might not be worth the risk to our warband. Still, an actual human hunter. She longed so much in her heart to try, to prove herself to her pride mothers, and... Zin Shiki blinked. She'd become too lost in her hopes and dreams, and oh so casually pressed her tail down, as it threatened to spring up straight.
Oh, Dark Mother, please don't let him see me get a stiffy.
Thank you, Miss Elvia. Tom was doing his best to take it easy, but getting anything out of the girls was like pulling hen's teeth. It felt like his first day at the academy all over again, but somehow it was worse. The whole standing at attention thing really bothered him. I know it's traditional here, but humor me while I'm here for the week. You really don't have to stand. That brought him to Miss Zin Shiki. I hope I said that right. One of the girls muttered something under her breath, getting a laugh from the girl sitting near. It hadn't escaped him that the Pezrin girl was sitting well off to the side, and alone. It didn't take a lot of effort to see who the butt of the joke was, as the Pezrin girl's ears flattened. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, Miss... Parada? Tom felt his eyebrows knitting together, and gave her some effort. Jama would have been proud. Was it something you'd like to share? The girl marked on his chart as Parada Nikto stood up, and after some hesitation she doubled down.
No, sir, it was nothing. Just a casual remark.
And yet it was good enough to interrupt your classmate when it was her turn. The idea didn't seem to faze the girl in the slightest, and he arched an eyebrow. As well as interrupting me. If this class was an example of how things worked at Soshi Pantechnical, Tom couldn't say he was a fan. That didn't mean he wouldn't make it work for him, and as he left the girl standing, she started to fidget. You have something to share, so I hope you will enlighten all of us. I know that I, personally, am waiting, Miss Parada. Please, fill the room with your wisdom.
Well, sir, I just didn't think she'd have much to offer.
Parada swayed slightly toward her chair. I didn't tell you to be seated, Miss Parada. The girl shot ramrod straight, which felt a bit unjust. He'd been trying to make himself at home with that one thing, and now he was going back on it. But the more he heard, the more it ticked him off. You made a statement. As you may have noticed, I am not from around these parts. Please to justify it to me.
It's true, Professor. Everyone knows it. As long as the Pezrin live as roving warbands, they're nothing but a little people. Silly, greedy mercenaries at best. At worst, they're nothing but cannibals. They're barbarous and cruel, and that's all they want to be.
That may be, or it may not. Let's just say for the moment that you're right. The Shulvanti had a perfectly good understanding of sarcasm, but playing devil's advocate wasn't something they took to naturally. Given how the Pezrin girl's ears were plastered to a skull, it was a fair guess the Pezrin might not either. Your entire statement is predicated on the idea of them being unsettled. She isn't unsettled, and she's here in this classroom, right now. How do you reconcile that?
Professor, the furballs are—
That's quite enough, Tom snapped. Perhaps it was being the outsider looking in. He knew he'd enjoy certain benefits as a male. The Academy seemed to try its best with him, and while that sometimes led to exciting adventures teaching sex ed, after the first few months the girls around campus no longer stared. Neither did the women on the faculty. Well, not as much. That made this morning with Vemi Rasani all the more galling. What did it matter if he enjoyed the deference of being a male professor? He was 2 steps removed from being a second-class citizen, watching as the girl talked down to the Pezrin. Another second-class citizen. It didn't sit well. Fine. What would a Shulvanti understand? A few years before the Empire came to my world, I learned I was now something called a cis-male, which turned out means someone whose male gender identity corresponded with their sex at birth. Tom kept his voice neutral, pushing the anger aside. This was a teaching moment, if he could make it one. It was all part of a social trend called being woke, though when I was your age, the big topic was something called ebonics. Tom looked at a room full of lost faces. Fair enough. He was pretty far off the map as far as teaching about a man's magazine. But he could cover the whole page by rote in less than 15 minutes, so who bloody cared? Of course, that got pushback. Not everyone likes change, particularly when it goes to excess, and people started to insult stupid wokeness. I assure you that it was nothing new. You could have replaced wokeness with political correctness, or any of its other predecessors. Wokeness was only the latest label for an ongoing social trend, and while there was nothing new about it, there was still a point. The girls were a sea of apprehension, but they looked more engaged. Perhaps it was because he was lecturing instead of questioning. He hated rote teaching with all its unquestioning glory. It wasn't how he wanted this to be, but the girls seemed on surer footing, if only by inches. The Pezrin girl's ears had perked back up. As jolting as it can be when language tries to reflect our values, it's far more jolting when it doesn't. Can you imagine calling people with mental disabilities retards? They used to be common on my planet. How about a news story where a human with dark skin could be called a hulking Negro brute? Can you imagine doing that to a Shulvanti over their hair color? 2 of the girls in the class had silver hair, and they glanced over at the others, who were looking back. So was growing up saying, honest Injun, or that someone didn't have a Chinaman's chance. Flip human gender around, because some of us would have said certain jobs were men's work, little lady, or that to haggle with someone was to Jew them down, which insulted a whole religious and ethnic community. Yes, much to my embarrassment, all of that was common, until we made it change. That got their attention. His future mothers-in-law were driving his religious tolerance to his limits, but it made sense to them. In the divine household that was the Shulvanti pantheon, a family hung together even when they didn't like each other very much. Whether it was from that perspective or some innate pragmatism, for not pissing off the locals. The shill had taken that attitude to the stars when it came to religion. Intolerance is corrosive. It eats through the bonds holding civilization together. Alright, people don't want to feel as if they're verbally walking on eggshells, but that doesn't mean they should walk anywhere they please, stomping on the dignity of others. I won't have it in this classroom. Is that understood? That got a sea of nods and, yes, professors, from the girls. The Persian girl said nothing, but she was looking at him intently again. Maybe he'd embarrassed her by stepping in. He tried not to stare and find out. Anyway, he tried for a lesson. He wanted to stick the landing. For good or ill, you can't say what you mean, unless you mean what you're saying. So we strive towards enlightenment, and it's our language that shows the way. That seemed good enough. Miss Zin Shiki? The hunter's pronunciation was terrible, but he had done her honor by trying to pronounce her true name properly. Still, what did it matter if it was somewhat off? He had defended her honor. Not only did that establish him as a proper pride trainer, but his Gahakt was sure. He'd practically quoted from the 20 Kahakchat, which told every Pesrin that you could not hunt down the path to a thing's truth without knowing its proper name. Still, she'd given an oath to her pride mothers not to cause the warband any problems. They'd given their word to the Duchess who held their contract, so there were matters of honor in the balance. It needed careful consideration. Following the dreaded custom of standing up and exposing herself, she rose. I am Zin Shiki Green Eyes of the Natashta Warband. I have the honor to serve as my pride mother's guard, the Duchess of House Eilina. Until our contract ends, I am here, duty-bound to study beside these persons. She'd nearly spat out the word. The Shilvanti were unworthy prey, though out of deference to his order, she did not call them Pahaksh as they deserved. Surely the hunter understood. Still, Professor, you said we could ask you questions. She braced herself properly, her tail assuming the right angle as it looped down about her waist in respectful deference. Certainly. The hunter stood up from where he had leaned against the desk. For a wounded elder, there was even more respect. What would you like to know? My people place great importance on names. That was true, particularly as far as ritual went. Would you tell me about your name, please? All right. My name is Thomas Alexander Warwick. What in particular would you like to know? Your true name. Thomas? That is a noble name? Honestly, not really. The human bared his fangs again. It might have been a smile, though it could as easily have been defiance to an impertinent kit. After all, he was a proven killer, and she felt ashamed as he continued. It's pretty common on Earth. And Warwick. It is a hunter's name? It's my family name, after where they came from, originally. That at least made sense. It showed an honourable devotion to the history of his family line. As a Pesrin, she understood such things. Even so, it was disappointing. I suppose the hunter's name I have is Alexander, who was a great warrior on my world. Zin Shiki felt her fur start to bristle as the hunter carried on. I wasn't named after him, though. About 7 generations back, my grandmother married a woman called Molly Alexander. They must have really loved each other, as my family kept the tradition of using it as a middle name alive ever since. Unfortunately, my daughter was killed, so the name will die with me. Her nose quivered. She was sure her nose quivered as she fought the excitement down. She would not embarrass herself, but still, the idea of a hunter dying and his name being lost, it was unthinkable. Such a thing couldn't be allowed to happen, particularly if he knew his lineage to 7 generations. It wasn't the minimum of 10 that was expected for a Pezrin, but still. I guess the closest I have to a warrior line would be my mother's side. Mum came down from a Viking ruler named Onudson Evilheart. Though before any of you start treating me like a noble, that was a good 35 generations back. Warwick bared his teeth in defiance again. She could barely believe it. 35? He could sing his lineage to 35 generations, and his name would just die out? It could not be. No Pezrin would allow it. She would do him honor, carry his name. She could become She Who Ate Evil's Heart. It was a perfect name. The Shilvanti be damned. He would be her prey. Of course, she'd save the liver. Her tail took up the right Murasaic as she raised her voice in challenge, screaming the appropriate cry as ritual demanded. Chirrow! Beg pardon? Tom looked around the class after the bell rang. One of the girls had come down to the lectern as he watched the Pezrin girl stalk from the room. She was around Nesva's height, with short silver hair and a heart-shaped face. Her expression was open and friendly, if hesitant. Yes, Generis, isn't it? Yes, Professor. I wanted to thank you for an interesting class. Anyway, I thought you might need this. She held up her omnipad. Reflexively, he took his up and accepted the file. Do you know what just happened? Oh, that? She's challenged you to be hunted, sir. Nodding at his omnipad, she gave him a sheepish look. We did some research because we all expected it could be one of us. I'm sorry. Tom checked his hearing, but the word for hunted in Vakita was fairly clear. Still, did you just say hunted? Yes, sir, to the death. She wants to eat you. It's a Pezrin thing. Generis nodded, her hair bobbing slightly. Anyway, I had a quick talk with the girls, and we wanted to thank you for being here, and express the words that mean so much to us right now. Tom searched his mind. Being hunted to the death should have focused his mind more. Maybe it was a language barrier. I'm sorry. What words? Better you than us. Belda settled heavily into her chair, staring at her lunch tray. She didn't feel hungry, but it was something to do. Misery loved company, even if the rest of the girls were only, in a bit of a funk. So, what did you think? Jaxmi was picking at her platter of helkers, looking at the mollusks without much enthusiasm, and Belda looked up to see her waving one around the table. It was traditional, Nesva offered hesitantly. Belda looked back down at her tray in embarrassment. Even if she managed to cover up how betrayed she had imagined she was by Nesva, she knew she'd made a mistake. Well, she knew it now. It was humiliating. She loved Liam so much that she'd been busy making a fool of herself. What had the movie called it? A madness most discreet? She'd almost been anything but. How would the others feel if they thought that she thought they'd been betraying her? What would she think if she thought they... No. It wasn't worth going around that all over again. Goddess be praised, at least she managed to cover up her mistake. If Nesva was right, Liam would even be worth a sizable dowry. Her family would be overjoyed. But instead of a penniless, hot, tall... She started to blush again. She hated that she did it so easily, but it was impossible not to. But now? Now she had to call his matriarch and ask to marry her wealthy brother. To make matters worse, she'd already waited longer than any girl should. What would the woman think? Maybe she could play it cool. That she'd been busy studying, so she'd earn a good living and be a good prospect. Something. She couldn't mess it up like she almost had with Nesva and the rest of her friends. I don't know, started Kaslin. Professor Borai had made her identify herself in class. Even with the girls doing it themselves, that had felt odd, like the normal balance of the day had missed a step. At least Kamara chimed in on cue.
It was off. I mean, I know we usually learn that way, but human studies was different from the start, you know?
She's right, Pris nodded, setting down her drink and picking at the papaya on her tray. We got used to it being taught that way from the beginning. That's why it felt all wrong.
It was miserable. I hated it. She even skipped a week's worth of material, Desi grumbled. I bet he's going to be pissed.
The professor? Maybe. Sefin nodded solemnly. You think he'll start us over when he gets back?
Who knows?
Letzi shrugged, grimacing at her platter.
I didn't like it, that's for sure. I mean, I'm sure it's not traditional, but I like being asked about the material. It's like...
Getting the meat out of a hellcass, Jack said, looking at the shell in her hand. Not as easy as using a tool, but it's kind of satisfying.
Yeah, I guess it is.
Lark was staring at her omnipad. She usually made notes on everything after class, but today, she looked like Belder felt. Maybe that was something.
Well, we have 2 more classes with her. He'll be back before we know it, Belder offered, though it sounded half-hearted even to her.
Which was fair, considering...
Pris? Nesva?
Nesva looked up. She was halfway through a bite of something and canted her head. Pris was looking at her and grinning, but she already knew. There was nothing for it now.
It's just... I need to call Lady Klassen and ask for a 6th date. I wondered, would you sit in with me while I make the call? Goddess, that's right.
Sefe broke into a smile.
Going to sweep him off his feet, Belle? If she gets permission.
Letzi grinned cheekily.
She'll get it, Nesva said with a confidence Belder wished she could feel. Then it'll be Melondi's turn.
Yeah, Desi drawled, grinning over at Mel.
I don't think Mr. Dasari will need too much convincing.
I don't know. I thought he'd sneak into her room. Pylis glanced at her co-wives. With nothing else to do until Shalea and Tom got home from their work, it was as good a time as any to discuss their first impressions.
He was very polite,
Della shrugged, looking at her co-wives thoughtfully.
You said he was singing last night. Some human thing.
Hegel nodded, as she sipped at her hot clava.
I couldn't understand a word of it. And you're sure he didn't know you were there?
Della asked casually.
Please, after all these years?
Hegel jutted her tusks at Della lightly.
My days as a Marine Scout may be long gone, but in the dark on the soft carpet, he didn't have a clue. You said he wasn't sleeping in the nude,
Pylis said, a trifle harshly, pursing her lips.
He only had a pair of shorts on. I saw him when he pushed the sheet off.
Hegel's eyes sparkled.
Shirtless as the day he was born. I tell you, if I were 20 years younger, I'd love to crack that nut and... We get the idea, hey?
Della waved her co-wife down before she got on a roll.
He does seem hot, though. I'll say, Leia didn't tell us that part, or...
Della shook her head.
Not that kind of hot, hey? The regular kind.
Hot? It's barely 90 in here, Pylis groused, rubbing her arms as if she was cold. It was a trifle cool, but they were making themselves at home, free from the confines of clothing and the privacy of a family abode. It was only a bit nippy.
I didn't get properly warm until I lit the fireplace. Oh, stop picking, Della sniffed. What matters is he's showing proper reverence for our traditions. He's a good boy.
Maybe, Pylis said defensively.
One night is a little too soon to tell. Well, we're here for the rest of the week, not just one shell. That gives us plenty of time to see what he's like, Hegel said with a cheeky grin. Leia will like that. That's true. Della nodded to her co-wives. It's in her best interests.
Borai huffed, jutting her tusks at Belder dismissively. Clearly this Hitler woman had a sense of... God damn it. Clearly, this Hitler woman had a sensible attitude. Not everyone is born into privilege, and you could learn a lesson there. Now... Oh, come on. Oh, this is too much.